Hello everybody and welcome to the Chinese Civilizations channel. My name is Timothy and in this channel we are going to do deep dives into Chinese culture, heritage and of course civilization. And because we have one whole channel to work on this, we are going to cover every aspect of it, almost leaving no stone unturned. If you have seen in my earlier video, I have done one video on prehistoric China, and then the video before this one was on the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, which is also a period of China between prehistory and recorded history. Today we are diving into the Xia Dynasty, which is considered as the first dynasty of the Chinese civilization. But even the Xia Dynasty, which predates the Zhou Dynasty and Shang Dynasty, even the Xia Dynasty is considered somewhere between prehistory and recorded history. And so not everything that we know about the Xia Dynasty is recorded in archaeological find. However, scholars have traced the whereabouts of where the Xia Dynasty was, and it more or less overlaps with the early Tang culture, which I mentioned in our video on prehistoric China. So if you have not seen the video on prehistoric China, I'm going to put the link somewhere over here, and so you can have a look at that and perhaps watch that particular video to get some context on these very early cultures of China. And so in this video, we are diving into the Xia Dynasty. I hope that through my explanation and all my explanation as far as possible, if I have enough material, I will put them into 12 chapters and followed by an epilogue. So that's the format that I will be using. There will be 12 chapters of explanation and ends with an epilogue. And so without saying further, let's dive into the Xia Dynasty of the Chinese civilization. Chapter 1. Introducing the Xia Dynasty, Legend or Reality. As we begin our exploration of the Xia Dynasty or Xia Chao, we must first confront an intriguing question. Did it really exist? This is not just a modern academic debate, but a question that reaches to the heart of China's origins. In traditional Chinese historiography, the Xia is accepted as the very first dynasty of China, preceding the Shang and Zhou dynasties. The earliest accounts of the Xia come from texts like the Shiqi or Records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian, written over 1,000 years after the supposed founding of the dynasty. Earlier still, the Shu Jing or Book of Documents mentions the Xia in passing. But herein lies the problem. All these references were recorded much later, long after the Xia had supposedly vanished from history. What this means is that much of what we know about the Xia comes from retrospective storytelling, where history blends with legend. This leads some scholars to argue that the Xia Dynasty may be more of a cultural memory than a political reality, a symbolic dynasty invented to explain the emergence of Chinese civilization. And yet, in recent decades, archaeological discoveries have begun to shift that perspective. Excavation at sites such as early Tang near Luoyang in Henan province reveal evidence of a large Bronze Age settlement dating to around 1900 BCE. Could this have been the capital of the Xia? Some Chinese archaeologists believe so, though the link remains unproven. From a historian's viewpoint, it is important to approach the Xia Dynasty with a balance of skepticism and respect. Skepticism because much of the narrative may indeed be legendary. Respect because these legends are not meaningless. They reflect early Chinese ideas of kingship, morality, and the struggle against nature. As we delve deeper into this video, I invite you to consider both sides. The Xia as a dynasty of kings who rule a real people, and the Xia as a foundational myth that helped shape the identity of early Chinese civilization. Whether real, imagined, or something in between, the Xia marks the symbolic beginning of the Chinese story. Chapter 2: Yi the Great, the founder of the Xia Dynasty. At the heart of the Xia Dynasty's origin story stands a single figure, Yi the Great or Da Yi. Revered as a culture hero in Chinese tradition, Yi is credited not only with founding the Xia Dynasty, but also with taming the great floods that once ravaged ancient China. But who was Yi the Great? And what do we really know about him? According to the legends, before Yi's time, devastating floods repeatedly threatened early Chinese communities along the Yellow River. The waters were said to submerge fields and villages, making life nearly impossible. Yi's father, Guan, had tried to stop the floods but failed. When Yi took over the task, he did something revolutionary. Instead of trying to block the water, Yi worked with it. He is said to have dug channels, dredged riverbeds, and created canals to guide the water safely back to the sea. For this achievement, Yi became a symbol of selfless leadership. The stories say that he worked tirelessly, traveling across the land, inspecting rivers and mountains himself. One famous saying claims that during his years of flood control, Yi passed by his own home 3 times without ever stopping in. So dedicated was he to his mission. In reward for his success, the tribal leaders of ancient China chose Yi as their ruler. This marked a shift from the earlier system of tribal confederations by a hereditary monarchy. Yi's son, Xi, inherited the throne, and with that, the Xia dynasty was born. But was Yi a real historical figure? This is where history blurs with myth. Some scholars suggest that Yi may have been based on a real leader who organized early flood control and unification efforts, though the details were mythologized over time. Interestingly, modern science does support the idea of catastrophic floods in ancient China. Around 1900 BCE, geological evidence shows a massive flood along the Yellow River, lending possible credibility to the flood legend. Whether Yi the Great was a real king or a legendary hero, his story holds deep meaning for the Chinese civilization. He represents order over chaos, human effort triumphing over nature, and the ideal of a ruler who serves the people above all else. In many ways, Yi the Great is not just the founder of the Xia dynasty, he is the founding symbol of Chinese kingship itself. Chapter 3: The Land of Xia, Heartland of Early China. To understand the Xia dynasty, we must first understand the land they ruled, a landscape dominated by rivers, valleys, and fertile plains. According to traditional accounts, the Xia dynasty controlled much of what is today western Henan, southern Shanxi, and parts of Shaanxi provinces. This region, centered around the Yellow River or Huanghe, is often called the cradle of Chinese civilization. Why was this area so important? Simply put, the Yellow River Basin provided the essential resources for early farming societies: fertile soil, fresh water, and relatively flat terrain. The river's seasonal floods deposited thick layers of loess, a fine fertile soil ideal for growing millet, which was the staple crop of ancient northern China. However, the Yellow River was both a blessing and a curse. While it brought fertility, its unpredictable floods could wipe out entire villages. This constant battle against nature likely shaped not only the survival strategies of early Chinese societies, but also their political structures. Leaders who could organize flood control projects like the legendary Yi the Great would have held great power and prestige. But when we ask where exactly the Xia Dynasty's capital stood, the answer becomes less certain. Ancient texts name several possible capitals, such as Yangcheng and Zhenxin, yet their precise locations are unknown. Some archaeologists point to the early Tao culture site near modern Luoyang in Henan province. Dating from roughly 1900 to 1500 BCE, early Tao reveals evidence of a large organized settlement. Palatial buildings, bronze workshops, and road networks suggest a centralized authority. Many Chinese scholars associate early Tao with the Xia dynasty, though this remains debated internationally. Beyond its cities, the Xia realm likely consisted of small farming villages spread across the river valleys. These communities would have depended on the central authority for protection and large-scale projects like flood management, but everyday life remained focused on agriculture, animal husbandry, and local trade. In short, the Xia dynasty's heartland lay in the central plains of northern China, a region that would continue to be the political and cultural core of Chinese civilization for millennia. Whether myth or history, the story of the Xia begins in these lands of rivers and valleys where nature's power demanded both resilience and unity from its people. Chapter 4: Timeline of the Xia. When did the first dynasty rule? One of the most puzzling questions about the Xia dynasty or Xia Chao is this: when did it actually exist? Unlike later dynasties, which left behind clear written records and datable artifacts, the Xia sits at the hazy intersection of history and legend. But based on ancient texts and modern archaeological studies, scholars have pieced together an approximate timeline. Traditional Chinese sources, such as the record of the Grand Historian or the Bamboo Annals, place the start of the Xia dynasty around 2070 BCE. According to these records, the dynasty lasted for roughly 400 years, ending around 1600 BCE with the rise of the Shang dynasty. These dates are part of what is known as the Xia-Shang-Zhou chronological project, a major research effort launched by Chinese scholars in the late 20th century to establish a reliable timeline for China's earliest dynasties. However, outside of China, many historians remain cautious. Why? Because the Xia's existence is primarily based on texts written long after the dynasty's supposed fall. Without contemporary written records or clear archaeological links, it's difficult to confirm the Xia as a historical dynasty with certainty. What about the archaeological evidence? This is where the early Tao culture enters the discussion. Radiocarbon dating places early Tao's peak between 1900 BCE and 1500 BCE, aligning closely with the traditional dates of the Xia. The site at early Tao reveals signs of a large urban center with palatial buildings, sophisticated bronze casting, and organized roadways, clear indicators of state-level society. Some scholars propose that the early Tao culture represents the archaeological remains of the Xia dynasty, though others caution that the link remains unproven. Adding to the complexity is the possibility that the Xia was not a single unified kingdom in its early years, but rather a loose network of tribal communities gradually coalescing into a centralized state. If this is the case, then the Xia dynasty may have developed over generations, its early stages remembered only in oral tradition before being written down centuries later. In summary, if we accept the traditional timeline, the Xia dynasty ruled from around 2070 BCE to 1600 BCE, lasting nearly 4 centuries. However, whether those centuries represent an actual dynasty or a remembered era of early kings and heroes remains open to interpretation. Regardless, the Xia marks the symbolic start of China's dynastic history, a beginning that, whether fact or legend, laid the foundation for what would become the world's longest continuous civilization. Chapter 5: Kings of the Xia, Sovereigns of Early China. In traditional Chinese historiography, the Xia dynasty is presented as the first hereditary monarchy in China's long imperial story. But who were the rulers of this elusive dynasty? While archaeological evidence remains uncertain, ancient texts provide us with a list of names, 17 kings spanning what was said to be nearly 4 centuries. At the head of this royal line stands Yi the Great, the legendary founder whose flood control efforts earned him the mandate of heaven. After Yi's death, power passed not to a chosen successor, but to his son Xi. This succession from father to son is significant. It marked the shift from leadership based on merit and election, typical of earlier tribal alliances, to hereditary monarchy, where kingship became the privilege of a single family. Thus, Yi's personal authority transformed into a royal lineage. What do we know of King Xi? According to legend, Xi consolidated his rule by suppressing rebellions from rival tribes. His reign, like his father's, is presented as divinely sanctioned, establishing the Xia's royal authority. After Xi, the throne passed down through successive kings, each inheriting rule as part of this dynastic system. Unfortunately, historical records from this period are sparse. Later historians listed names and occasionally ascribed brief anecdotes to these rulers, but few concrete details survive. We know the names of kings like Tai Kang, whose rule was supposedly weak and who lost control over parts of the realm, and Shao Kang, remembered for restoring Xia power after a period of decline. However, it was the last king of the Xia, Jie of Xia, who stands out most vividly in the historical imagination. Jie is portrayed as a tyrant, cruel, extravagant, and morally corrupt. His rule was marked by heavy taxation, forced labor, and harsh punishments. Ancient writers describe his decadence in detail. He supposedly built a vast palace, hosted wild feasts, and neglected his people's suffering. Jie's failure as a ruler, according to tradition, led to rebellion and the eventual overthrow of the Xia by Tang of Shang. It's important to understand that these characterizations, especially of Jie, may be more moral lesson than factual records. Early Chinese historians often frame history as a cycle. Good rulers brought prosperity, corrupt ones invited collapse. In that context, King Xia became a cautionary example, a failed monarch whose downfall justified the rise of a new dynasty. In the end, the sovereigns of the Xia dynasty occupied an ambiguous space between myth and memory. Were they real kings ruling real cities, or symbolic figures representing the struggles and transformations of early Chinese society? Perhaps both. Regardless of their historical accuracy, the kings of Xia remain central to China's understanding of its dynastic origins, a royal line said to stretch back over 4,000 years to the dawn of Chinese civilization itself. Chapter 6: Life in Xia Times, People, Work, and Daily Life. When we imagine the Xia dynasty, it's easy to focus solely on kings and palaces. Yet behind every dynasty are its people, the farmers, artisans, and laborers whose daily work formed the true foundation of early Chinese society. What was life like for the ordinary people during Xia times? While direct evidence from the Xia period is limited, archaeologists studying Bronze Age sites like Loewe provide us with clues. The majority of Xia's population likely lived in small farming villages scattered across the Yellow River basin. These communities depended on millet farming, one of the earliest staple crops of northern China. Fields were worked with simple tools, likely made from stone or early bronze. Farmers also raised animals, pigs, dogs, cattle, and perhaps sheep for food and labor. Life in these early villages would have been communal. Families worked together to plant, harvest, and manage livestock. Clay houses with thatched roofs likely formed the typical dwelling, clustered together in simple settlements. Though life was hard with the constant threat of flood and poor harvests, communities found strength in cooperation. Beyond farming, evidence suggests the presence of craft specialists, particularly in bronze and pottery production. In larger settlements like Loewe, artisans worked with early bronze technology to create ritual vessels, tools, and weapons. The bronze vessels in particular held significant symbolic value, possibly used in ancestral worship or state rituals. Pottery production also thrived with distinctive grey and painted ceramics found at archaeological sites. Trade and exchange likely played a small but important role in Xia society. While large-scale commerce had not yet developed, communities probably traded surplus crops, animal products, and crafted goods with neighboring villages. This network of exchange helped spread innovations like bronze casting and new farming techniques. Social structure during the Xia dynasty was probably hierarchical, though not yet as rigid as in later dynasties. At the top were the royal family and noble clans who controlled land and resources. Below them were skilled artisans and farmers, forming the backbone of the economy. Laborers and possibly enslaved people occupied the lowest levels of society. One fascinating aspect of life in Xia times was the relationship with nature and ancestors. Rituals honoring spirits and ancestors were likely common. The belief that human actions, like proper rituals and offerings, could influence floods, harvests, and disasters shaped both daily life and early Chinese religion. In summary, life during the Xia dynasty was simple yet structured, revolving around agriculture, early crafts, and communal living. These humble beginnings set the stage for more complex societies that would emerge in the Shang and Zhou dynasties. Though much about Xia daily life remains hidden in the mist of time, what we do know point to a society that, while primitive by later standards, laid the groundwork for the vast civilization that China would become. Chapter 7, Society and Culture, Early Traditions of the Xia Dynasty. When exploring the Xia Dynasty, it's important not to see it merely as a political entity of kings and capitals. Equally significant are the cultural practices and social structures that shaped life during this formative period of Chinese civilization. While much remains uncertain, archaeology and later historical texts offer intriguing glimpses into Xia dynasty and culture. At the core of Xia culture was a deep connection to nature and ancestry. Rituals dedicated to spirits, gods of rivers and mountains, and ancestral forebear likely played a central role in daily and ceremonial life. These early religious beliefs reflected the people's constant struggle with natural forces like floods and droughts. Sacrifices and offerings would have been seen as essential to maintaining harmony between the human world and the spirit realm, a tradition that continued and evolved in later dynasties. Perhaps the most symbolic artifact of Xia culture are the bronze ritual vessels unearthed at sites like Loewe. While simpler than those of the Shang dynasty, these vessels suggest an early tradition of ritual feasting, ancestral worship, and possibly even state-sponsored religious ceremonies. Control over bronze production may have been limited to the elite, reinforcing social hierarchies and royal authority. In terms of material culture, Xia society produced distinctive pottery, especially grey and painted ceramics. Pottery styles often differed between regions, hinting at local identities within the broader Xia realm. Simple jade ornaments and stone tools have also been found, indicating that luxury goods and status symbols were beginning to emerge. Social structure in Xia times are likely hierarchical but fluid. At the top were the ruling family and noble clans who commanded respect through military strength, control of resources, and their perceived connection to the divine. Below them were the artisans, skilled craftsmen who produced bronze tools and ritual items central to Xia culture. Most of the population, however, were farmers and laborers whose agricultural work sustained the dynasty. Interestingly, Xia dynasty may have begun to develop the earliest form of written communication, though no definitive writing system has yet been discovered from this period. Some scholars suggest that carved symbols on jade and pottery fragments could represent proto-writing or clan symbols, possibly the precursor to Chinese characters. Beyond rituals and craftsmanship, Xia culture also likely valued music and dance, as these were mentioned in later records describing court life and ceremonies. Music, like ritual, was seen as a means of harmonizing society and connecting with ancestral spirits. In many ways, Xia culture represents the roots of Chinese civilization. The emphasis on family and ancestors, respect for nature's power, and the use of ritual and ceremony to establish social order. These early traditions would evolve and strengthen under the Shang and Zhou dynasties, but their origins may well trace back to the Xia. Though much about Xia dynasty remains hidden, what we can piece together reveals a people slowly moving from tribal life to organized civilization, laying down the early cultural pattern that would shape China's future. Chapter 8, Economy of the Xia dynasty, Farming, Craft, and Trade. To understand the Xia dynasty beyond its kings and legends, We must consider its economy, the foundation upon which any early civilization depends. What supported the Xia state? How did its people make a living? The answers help us glimpse the practical realities of life over 4,000 years ago. At its heart, the Xia economy is agrarian. Farming was the backbone of society, just as it would remain throughout much of China's history. The fertile plains of the Yellow River Basin, enriched by seasonal floods, allowed for the cultivation of millet, which was the main staple crop of northern China at the time. This hardy grain suited the dry, lowest-rich soil of the region. Farmers likely practiced simple slash and burn agriculture in some areas, clearing forests to create fields. Livestock farming played a supporting role. Archaeological evidence suggests the domestication of pigs, dogs, cattle, and sheep. Pigs in particular were common in early Chinese communities, valued for both food and ritual sacrifice. Surpluses were modest, but when harvests were good, villagers might store excess grain for leaner times. This would have been crucial in a society still vulnerable to flood and drought. Royal authorities or local chieftains in earlier phases may have collected part of this surplus as tribute or tax, especially to support large projects like flood control or the building of palaces and ritual centers. Alongside farming, craft production formed the second pillar of the Xia economy. In larger settlements, particularly at sites like Loewe, specialized artisans worked in bronze metallurgy, a key technological advance of the period. Early bronze tools, weapons, and ritual vessels indicate both technological skill and a society capable of supporting specialist craftsmen. Bronze, however, was rare and probably restricted to the elite, symbolizing power and status. Pottery production was more widespread. Xia potters created both utilitarian vessels for daily use and finer wares that may have served ritual or priestly purposes. The diversity of pottery styles hint at local variation and craftsmanship. What about trade? While large-scale commerce had not yet developed, evidence suggests a system of barter or local exchange. Communities likely traded goods such as surplus grain, livestock, pottery, jade ornaments, and stone tools. The movement of certain raw materials such as copper and tin needed for bronze suggests limited long-distance exchange networks, possibly controlled by ruling elites. Interestingly, no coinage existed during the Xia Dynasty. The idea of money as currency would emerge much later. Economic exchanges were based on barter or the exchange of goods and services, often within the framework of kingship or tribute. In essence, the Xia economy was simple but functional. It was designed to support basic needs, sustain local communities, and fund the projects and rituals that reinforce royal authority. While humbled by later standards, this early economic structure laid the foundations for the increasingly sophisticated economies of the Shang and Zhou dynasties that followed. By examining the Xia's farming, craftsmanship, and emerging trade, we begin to see the outlines of a society slowly evolving from subsistence living to a more complex and interconnected civilization, one that would shape China's destiny for millennia to come. Chapter 9: Government and Rule. How was the Xia dynasty governed? The Xia dynasty holds a special place in Chinese tradition as the beginning of dynastic rule. But how did this early state govern its people? What did kingship and government look like in the Xia era? The Xia is traditionally remembered as China's first hereditary monarchy. Before the Xia, leadership among ancient tribes was based largely on merit, with chieftains or leaders chosen for their skills in battle, flood control, or negotiation. Yi the Great's rise to power, based on his success in taming the floods, reflects this earlier model. However, Yi's decision to pass power to his son Xi, instead of choosing a successor based on ability, marks the critical shift towards hereditary kingship. From this moment, rule became a family affair. So what did ruling the Xia dynasty involve? At the top of the hierarchy stood the king, viewed as both a political leader and a semi-sacred figure, believed to possess a special connection to the ancestors and natural world. The king's duty extended beyond warfare and governance to include ritual leadership. Performing ceremonies to honor ancestors and control nature's forces was considered essential to maintaining harmony between heaven and earth. This concept, which would later formalize as the mandate of heaven, likely had its roots in this early period. The king relied on a network of noble clans and local chieftains, many of whom governed smaller territories or villages in the name of the central ruler. These local leaders may have enjoyed considerable autonomy, especially in distant regions, but were expected to provide tribute, military support, and labor for the royal projects like flood control and palace construction. Beneath the nobles were artisans, farmers, and laborers who formed the majority of Xia society. They supported the dynasty through their agricultural work and, when required, through covey labor, that is, unpaid forced labor to build roads, irrigation systems, or defensive structures. The Xia government likely operated without written laws, at least in the formal sense we see in later dynasties. Instead, custom and tradition guided local governance, with royal edicts delivered orally through the king's representatives. Justice may have been harsh, as later accounts describe punishments such as exile, corporal punishment, or even execution, reflecting the ruler's effort to assert control over a largely rural population. Interestingly, as Xia kingship became more centralized over generations, royal authority grew increasingly tied to displays of wealth and power. Control over bronze production and access to ritual goods like jade were likely monopolized by the royal family and its inner circle, reinforcing their elevated status. As we approach the end of the Xia dynasty, the sources portray a government that had become increasingly oppressive under its final king, Jie of Xia. Heavy taxation, forced labor, and neglect of ritual responsibilities contributed to widespread dissatisfaction, a pattern familiar in later dynastic cycles of Chinese history. To some, Xia rule combined early forms of monarchical power, ritual leadership, and clan-based administration. Though simple compared to later dynasties, the Xia system represented a vital step in the evolution of Chinese governance, from tribal chieftainship to centralized dynastic authority. This blend of political control, ritual duty, and family lineage would define Chinese kingship for centuries to come. In the Xia dynasty, we see the earliest outlines of what it meant to govern China. Chapter 10: Challenges and Conflicts, the Struggles of the Xia dynasty. No dynasty exists without struggle, and the Xia dynasty was no exception. From its legendary beginnings to its eventual downfall, The Xia faced a constant stream of challenges, both from nature and from within. Understanding these struggles helps us grasp why the dynasty story ends as it does. One of the earliest and most persistent challenges of the Xia was the environment itself. Living along the Yellow River, the Xia people were at the mercy of devastating floods. Seasonal flooding could destroy harvests, wash away villages, and cripple the local economy. Although Yi the Great is celebrated for controlling these floods, the struggle against nature was ongoing. Periodic disasters would have weakened both central authority and public confidence in the royal house. Beyond nature's wrath, the Xia rulers also faced internal unrest. Early sources hint at rebellions and local uprisings, especially during times of weak leadership. When a king failed in his ritual duties or overburdened the population with labor and taxes, dissatisfaction grew. Rebellions might erupt, led by rival clans or local chieftains seeking to break away from central control. Over time, as royal authority became more centralized and rulers less accountable, tensions likely increased. A key example of this pattern is the reign of King Xia of Xia, the final monarch of the dynasty. According to tradition, Xia was a tyrant. He taxed his people heavily, conscripted them for grandiose palace projects, and led a life of extravagance while ignoring the hardship of ordinary farmers. Ancient texts describe Xia's obsession with luxury and pleasure. His infamous lake of wine and forest of meat is one such tale, where he supposedly filled a lake with alcohol and hung meat from trees to entertain guests. Such stories, whether true or not, reflect how Xia's rule was remembered as a textbook case of a ruler who lost heaven's favor. This internal decay opened the door to external threats. Among the Xia's neighbors were rising tribal powers, including the Shang people. Traditionally portrayed as a smaller but virtuous power, the Shang eventually challenged Xia rule under the leadership of Tang of Shang. Unlike the decadent Xia, Tang was seen as a wise and just leader. His rebellion against Xia was framed not merely as a political coup, but as a moral correction, what later historians would call the loss of the mandate of heaven. The rebellion culminated in the Battle of Mingtiao, where Tang's forces decisively defeated Xia's army during a great thunderstorm. Xia fled but was later captured and exiled, marking the official end of the Xia Dynasty and the rise of the Shang. In conclusion, the Xia Dynasty's challenges were both environmental and human. Floods, famines, rebellions, and the failure of leadership all played their part in the downfall of this early dynasty. While the precise details may have been lost to history, the pattern is clear. When rulers forgot their duty to the people and to heaven, collapse inevitably followed. Chapter 11: The Fall of the Xia, Collapse of the First Dynasty. The end of the Xia dynasty is one of the earliest examples in Chinese history of a political collapse framed as a moral and cosmic failure. While the details remain clouded by legend, the traditional narrative is both instructive and symbolic, echoing themes that would appear repeatedly throughout China's long dynastic history. At the heart of the Xia's downfall was King Xia of Xia, the dynasty's final ruler and, according to ancient texts, is most infamous. Xia is remembered not as a wise king, but as a tyrant. He is said to have abandoned ritual, ignored the welfare of his people, and indulged in extravagant pleasures. Heavy taxation and forced labor projects drained the resources of his kingdom. Grand palaces and pleasure gardens sprang up even as ordinary people struggled to feed their families. Yet, as historians, we must ask, were these stories of Xia's cruelty fact or moral storytelling? Ancient Chinese historians often frame history as a moral lesson. When rulers behaved justly, their reigns prospered. When they ruled cruelly, their dynasties fell. Xia's portrayal as a decadent tyrant may well have been exaggerated or even constructed to justify the dynasty's collapse and the Shang's subsequent rise. Nevertheless, traditional sources are clear. Dissatisfaction spread across the Xia realm. Local leaders and noble clans, once loyal to the royal house, began to break away. Among these challengers was Tang of Shang, the leader of a rising power to the east. Tang is portrayed as the opposite of Xia, virtuous, wise, and supported by heaven. He gathered strength gradually, forming alliances and positioning himself as a moral alternative to Xia tyranny. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Bingtiao. Tang's forces, disciplined and motivated, faced Xia's army during a violent thunderstorm. Traditional accounts describe Xia's defeat as swift and decisive. Realizing his cause was lost, Xia fled south but was soon captured. His reign ended in disgrace and exile. With Xia's fall, the Xia dynasty officially ended around 1600 BCE, marking the rise of the Shang dynasty, China's second and first archaeologically confirmed dynasty. What lessons were drawn from the fall of Xia? Ancient Chinese thinkers saw it as the first clear example of the mandate of heaven at work. When a ruler neglected virtue and failed his people, heaven withdrew its favor. A new, more deserving dynasty would then rise in his place. This concept of divine legitimacy, tied to moral leadership, became central to Chinese political philosophy. In many ways, the Xia's fall was the prototype for the cycles of rise and fall that would repeat across China's imperial history. Whether the Xia kings were historical rulers or partly mythologized, their stories set the pattern. Dynasties fall not just from external attacks, but from internal failure. Thus, the Xia dynasty came to an end not simply as a political entity, but as the first symbol of how dynasties lost the right to rule. A lesson that, in Chinese history, would never be forgotten. Chapter 12, Conclusion, the Legacy of the Xia Dynasty. As we conclude our exploration of the Xia Dynasty, we return to the question we asked at the start. Was it real? The answer, like the dynasty itself, lies somewhere between history and legend. From Yi the Great's heroic struggle against the floods to the tyranny of King Xia and the rise of the Shang, the story of the Xia dynasty is both a narrative of early kingship and a reflection of ancient Chinese values. Whether or not the Xia kings actually ruled from palaces over central China, their history has shaped Chinese civilization for over 3,000 years. In traditional Chinese thought, the Xia marks the beginning of the three dynasties period. The Xia, Shang, and Zhou, which formed the foundation of China's political philosophy. The Xia, as the first dynasty, set the precedence for concepts like hereditary rule, ritual kingship, and the mandate of heaven. Even the belief that a dynasty could lose its legitimacy through misrule began here with the fall of Xia. Archaeologically, the mystery remains unsolved. While sites like early Loewe provide tantalizing evidence of a large organized society existing during the traditional Xia period, we lack definitive proof linking these finds directly to the dynasty described in ancient texts. Was early Loewe the Xia? Or was the Xia merely a cultural memory projected back onto this early Bronze Age society? The debate continues. What cannot be denied is the power of the Xia narrative. For countless generations, the Xia dynasty has stood as the symbolic starting point of Chinese history. It reminds us that before history was written, stories were told, and in those stories lay the identity of a people. To the Chinese, the Xia represents more than just a first dynasty. It represents origin, both literal and cultural. It marks the moment when leadership became hereditary, when power was tied to ritual, and when human effort first sought to tame the Yellow River's flood, not just through labor, but through organization and governance. As we close this chapter on the Xia dynasty, remember that history is not only about what we can excavate from the earth. It is also about what endures in memory and tradition. Whether the Xia kings rule as history claims or not, their legacy continues. They are the ancestors of China's long dynastic story, a story that, in many ways, begins with them. Epilogue, the first chapter of China's story. The Xia dynasty remains a puzzle, somewhere between myth and history, between the words of ancient historians and the silent ruins unearthed by archaeologists. The truth of China's first dynasty continues to elude us. Yet, perhaps that is part of its enduring power. For the Chinese people, the Xia is more than a question of fact. It is the symbolic beginning of civilization itself, a dynasty that may have existed or may have been dreamed into being to explain the birth of kingship, law, and order. From Yi the Great taming the flood to Xia's final downfall, the story of the Xia teaches lessons about leadership, morality, and the fragile balance between human ambition and nature's power. Whether the Xia ruled from palaces of bronze and jade or only in the pages of Shu Jing and Shi Ji, its role in shaping Chinese identity cannot be denied. Every dynasty that followed, Shang, Zhou, Han, and beyond, looked back to the Xia as the prototype of rulership. To rule China was to follow in the footsteps of Yi the Great, to seek heaven's mandate, and to avoid the fate of King Jie. In the end, the Xia dynasty is not just a story of the past, it is the first chapter of China's grand historical narrative, a chapter still being written by historians, archaeologists, and storytellers alike. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the ancient past as we continue to explore the origin of Chinese civilization. One thing is certain, the story of the Xia dynasty, whether fact, legend, or something in between, will continue to captivate all who seek to understand where China's story truly began. And as I conclude this video, if you have enjoyed it, please give it a like so that YouTube will show it to more people, particularly those who are interested to know about China's history. And subscribe to the Chinese Civilization channel for more videos like this one as we continue to journey back into the past to understand everything about Chinese civilization. Until we meet again, this is Timothy signing off.